Your daughter's outfit is inappropriate for Willow Glen, Margot Hale sneered, her voice slicing through the humid air like glass. She stood at the end of my driveway, clipboard angled under her arm, sunglasses perched like a crown. My 15-year-old Emily froze on the porch in her denim shorts and t-shirt as Margot's smirk widened for the benefit of the neighbors peeking through blinds. I didn't flinch. I let her bask in her little show for 3 seconds, then dropped my truth. Funny thing about your clipboard, Margot. My husband trains federal agents on how to dismantle rackets that look exactly like what you're running here. The color drained from her smirk, only for a heartbeat. Just enough. If you know the fire that comes from standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now, because what happens next isn't a story, it's a reckoning. I stepped forward, my voice calm, but lined with steel. My name's David Mercer, civil engineer. I spend my life studying the structures people think can't collapse. But I also made a promise to my husband when he deployed with the Bureau that I'd keep Emily safe. That's not negotiable. Margot blinked, her grip on the clipboard tightening as if it were armor. She thought this was just about shorts. She had no idea what she'd stepped into. Because this wasn't about a dress code. This was about Emily, my daughter, the girl who still swung on the oak tree rope in our yard, where my father's ashes were buried at the roots. That oak was legacy, blood, memory. And Margot? She was trying to turn my child's body into a spectacle for her rules. I could still smell the faint varnish from when my father built that swing with his own hands, the summer before the stroke. He'd said, "Wood remembers kindness, son." I used to think he meant craftsmanship. Now I knew better. That tree remembered who protected it, and who threatened what it sheltered. The sun pressed hot against my back, sweat stinging my eyes, but the burn in my chest wasn't heat. It was heritage demanding a response. Every clap of a neighbor's gate, every curtain twitch was a witness choosing sides, even if they didn't realize it yet. Emily's knuckles whitened on the porch railing, her lips parted, but no sound came out. Just the kind of silence you hear when someone's dignity is being stripped away in public. I felt that silence like a fist in my chest, because I'd heard it before. The last silence from my father before the hospital monitor went flat. The silence that carried his final words to me. Protect them, always. Margot shifted her weight, emboldened by the lack of resistance from the neighbors' windows. If you don't comply, you'll be fined. Continued violations escalate. That's policy. She thought her authority was law. She thought my daughter's shame was her currency. But what she didn't realize was this. Her policy was nothing more than theater, and she just put herself under the spotlight, and watching, though she didn't see it yet, were eyes far more powerful than her neighbor's whispers. The weight of legacy burned in my chest as I put myself between Emily and Margot's clipboard. I wasn't just an engineer. I was the wall my daughter needed, and I knew one thing as I locked eyes with Margot Hale. This wasn't her neighborhood anymore. It was the place where her empire would crack. By dawn, the flyers were already plastered across Willow Glen. Bold black letters screamed, "Community Standards Reminder," across every mailbox and bulletin board. At the bottom, stamped in crimson, sat her favorite word, mandatory. Emily's picture wasn't printed on the sheet, not this time. But everyone knew the timing wasn't coincidence. The board chair wanted the whispers to do the work for her. She wanted humiliation to spread further than the reach of her clipboard. I pulled the flyer from our mailbox and felt the edges cut into my palm. Across the cul-de-sac, 2 kids abandoned their basketball game the second they saw me holding the paper. Their mother lingered at the curb, phone clutched tight, her eyes darting nervously toward the enforcer in crimson, striding down the block. The clipboard queen carried herself like royalty, heels snapping against the pavement as she handed out papers that looked less like reminders and more like summonses. Neighbors took them with hollow smiles that never reached their eyes. Nobody refused, nobody spoke. That was her genius, silence masquerading as order. But silence always fractures. Rachel Alvarez cracked first. The neighborhood had become an orchestra of submission. Sprinklers hissed on schedule, lawns gleamed with chemical obedience. Even laughter felt rehearsed, short, nervous, cautious. The only thing louder than compliance was the silence that followed it. I found her at the park bulletin board, nails digging into the wood as she ripped one of the postings down. Her 12-year-old stood behind her, clutching a skateboard like it could shield him from shame. Rachel's voice trembled as she spat the words. She fined him for a shirt logo, said it was vulgar. He's 12, David. 12. Her eyes glistened with a mixture of anger and defeat. We paid it so she wouldn't come back to our door. Her voice dropped. I feel like I failed him. Her words splintered me. The kind of guilt that makes parents lower their eyes instead of raising their voices. I'd seen that same look overseas in evacuation camps, the look of people who believed the rules were bigger than mercy. I folded the flyer so hard the paper split at the crease. You didn't fail him, Rachel. The tyrant in heels failed all of us. But she wasn't the only one carrying scars. By noon, stories bled out of every porch, whispered like confessions no one dared put in writing. Mr. Chen muttered about chalk drawings erased by fines. A retired teacher whispered about loss of voting privileges for refusing to repaint shutters. Each story carried the same weight, humiliation leveraged as law. And then there was Marcus Reed, the officer of rules loyal secretary, the quiet man with the pen who'd sat beside her in every meeting for years. I caught him outside his garage, wiping grease from his palms, eyes darting like a trapped animal. He didn't look at me at first, but when he did, something flickered. Guilt or fear, maybe both. Careful, David, he muttered, too low for anyone else to hear. Push her, and she'll push harder. His hand trembled as he shoved the rag into his pocket. He didn't wait for my reply, just turned, slamming the garage door harder than he needed to. It was the first real crack I'd seen in her wall, not paper, not whispers. A person. That night, Emily sat on the old swing under the oak tree, her knees pulled to her chest. The same swing her father had built, the same one she used to fly from while he clapped from the porch. Now she only swayed, staring into the branches above where the roots tangled with memory and ash. Her voice was small. Do they all hate me? I crouched beside her, my hand brushing her hair back. They don't hate you, Em. They're scared of her, but scared doesn't last forever. The clipboard queen believed her flyers were power, that every paper stapled to a post was another stone in her throne. But she didn't see what I saw, Rachel's anger breaking through shame, Marcus's hand shaking with secrets he couldn't keep buried, neighbors whispering louder than they used to. Fear was her stage, but the script was changing. I looked up at the oak tree, its roots wrapped around the ashes of the man who'd once sworn to protect this family. The rope swing creaked under Emily's weight, but it held. Stronger than the rules Margot claimed were carved in stone. Stronger than silence. I made a promise the night I buried my father. Protect the family. Protect the legacy. And I could feel that promise hardening now. The officer of rules thought humiliation would keep us bent. She had no idea what happens when silence turns into defiance. And when that moment came, she wouldn't just lose her clipboard, she'd lose the stage she built her empire on. The recreation center smelled of floor polish and recycled air, the kind of place meant for birthday parties and yoga classes, not public humiliation. But tonight, the clipboard queen had turned it into her courtroom. Rows of folding chairs filled the room. Every neighbor hunched in tense silence. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering like nervous eyelids. At the front, the enforcer in crimson perched behind the podium, clipboard gleaming in her grip, lips curved in that permanent smirk. She didn't need robes or gavels. Fear was her regalia. And beside her sat Marcus Reed, the board chair's loyal secretary, always scribbling notes, never raising his voice. But tonight, something was off. His collar sat crooked. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple before a single word was spoken. His hands never stilled, tapping his pen, straightening papers, rubbing his knuckles raw against the tabletop. He didn't need to speak. His body was screaming. The hum of the ceiling lights merged with the quick tap of his heel, an anxious metronome marking every second of conscience fighting cowardice. His reflection shimmered faintly in the podium's plexiglass, eyes darting as if a ghost were whispering all the names he'd helped find. The tyrant in heels called the meeting to order with her usual smug authority. This community has multiple violations pending review, she announced, eyes scanning the crowd before landing deliberately on Emily. My niece sat in the second row, shrinking into her seat, knuckles white around the armrest. The clipboard queen's smile widened. Certain residents, she said, have ignored repeated warnings. Her words sliced like blades. I leaned forward, not to challenge yet, but to watch. Because Marcus was unraveling, when she declared her new inspection protocols, clothing, conduct, property, all subject to review, his chair scraped back half an inch. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor. When he bent to retrieve it, his hand shook so violently it took the 3 tries. The neighbors noticed. Whispers rose like smoke. Rachel Alvarez pressed her hand to her son's arm, muttering in disbelief. Mr. Chen bowed his head, lips moving in silent prayer. For the first time, their eyes weren't just on the tyrant in heels, they were on the man beside her, watching his silence fracture. The officer of rules tried to reassert control, tapping her clipboard against the podium like a judge banging a gavel. But the cracks were there. Marcus's jaw clenched. His gaze dropped to the agenda, but his palm smeared the ink where sweat had soaked the page. When she leaned closer, whispering something sharp enough to slice, he flinched. Not a twitch. A full recoil, as if the air itself burned. And that recoil said everything. I caught his eye for a single second. He didn't hold the stare, but he didn't look away fast enough either. His pupils darted like a man caught in a trap, his chest rising and falling too quick. Patience. That's what I told myself. Silence can be as loud as confession when people are watching. The clipboard queen droned on about protecting values, maintaining order, upholding standards. But her voice no longer echoed unchecked. It bounced off the walls and returned hollow, because sitting right beside her was proof that even inside her fortress, the foundation was cracking. The meeting ended with her usual flourish, threats of fines, promises of stricter patrols, but the neighbors left differently this time. They didn't just whisper about her, they whispered about him. The man at her right hand who couldn't hold a pen steady. The man whose silence looked less like loyalty and more like guilt. Outside, the summer night wrapped the cul-de-sac in heavy air. Cicadas sawed in the trees. Rachel brushed past me, her words hushed but certain. He knows something. I watched Marcus linger by the doorway, head bowed, hands buried deep in his pockets. His wife's silhouette flickered in their window across the street, 2 small heads bobbing past behind her. He wasn't just carrying papers. He was carrying a war inside himself, and wars like that don't stay hidden forever. Emily tugged my arm, whispering, "Uncle David, she's never going to stop, is she?" I kept my eyes on Marcus. His shoulders sagged, his steps slow, but every movement screamed the same truth. Silence was killing him. "She will," I murmured back, "because men like him, they can't stand still forever." The next morning, a sharp crack jolted me from the porch, wood splintering under hammer blows. By the time I stepped outside, the enforcer in crimson was already nailing a notice to our fence. The paper bled with bold red ink, mandatory compliance. Emily's name circled 3 times, underlined like a target. The clipboard queen turned, sunglasses flashing, her smirk wide enough for the whole cul-de-sac to see. "Failure to comply," she declared, "will result in police enforcement." Emily's breath hitched. Rachel Alvarez, who had stopped at the curb with her son's skateboard in hand, clapped her palm over her mouth. Curtains lifted along the row of houses. The tyrant in heels wanted an audience, and she had one. I tore the notice down, paper ripping in my fists, but she only tilted her chin higher. The officer of rules lived for theater, and today, her stage was my driveway. She didn't just nail paper, she nailed reputations. Every thud of that hammer echoed like a countdown. Kids pressed their faces to windows. Parents pretended to sweep. Every soul pretending not to watch, but watching anyway. It struck me then. She wasn't managing a neighborhood. She was directing a play, and we were all unwilling actors afraid to miss our cues. By noon, her flyers sprouted across the neighborhood like weeds, stuffed in mailboxes, taped to garages, pinned to bulletin boards. Decency enforcement, protocol, a grotesque checklist of clothing, conduct, behavior. Mothers dragged children indoors. Teenagers rolled their eyes but hid their shorts anyway. Even the fathers, muttering curses, folded the flyers tight and shoved them into trash bins like they were explosives. But her victory wasn't the paper. It was the silence. At least until Marcus Reed appeared. I caught him at the cluster of mailboxes, shoulders hunched, hands shoved deep into his pockets. When his eyes met mine, he froze. For a heartbeat, I thought he'd bolt. Instead, he sighed and stayed. "You shouldn't let her get to Emily," he muttered, voice low. "Then stop enabling her," I shot. Back. His jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck so hard, it looked like he was trying to scrape the guilt off his skin. "It's not that simple," he whispered, before stuffing his mail under his arm and walking away, fast. But the crack in his armor had widened. The clipboard queen's own lieutenant was wobbling, and everyone could see it. By evening, the tyrant in heels doubled down. She strode down the block with 2 volunteers in tow, clipboards in hand like weapons, snapping photos of porches, fences, and front yards. Every click of her phone was deliberate, every scribbled note a strike of power. When she reached Rachel Alvarez's door, Rachel stood tall, blocking her path. Their voices rose sharp and hot, Spanish and English colliding across the lawn. Neighbors gathered in clusters, whispers flying faster than the cicadas buzzing in the trees. The enforcer in crimson didn't flinch. She basked in it. Power fed her like oxygen. But in the corner of the crowd, Marcus stood again, clipboard limp in his hand, eyes hollow. He didn't write a word. He couldn't. I stood at the edge of my driveway with Emily beside me, her sleeves tugged low over her hands. The clipboard queen saw me, smiled, and raised her board like a gavel. "This community will learn what standards mean," she shouted, voice slicing through the twilight. "Even if I have to enforce them house by house." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Rachel's son muttered something sharp under his breath. Mr. Chen crossed his arms, jaw clenched, silent but burning. And Marcus looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. That night, Emily cried in her room, muffling sobs into her pillow. I sat on the porch steps, the torn notice crumpled in my fist, and stared at the oak tree rising from the yard, its roots wrapped around my brother's ashes. That tree had stood storms and decades, but tonight, it felt like more than wood and soil. It was a promise, a reminder that some structures don't break, no matter how many blows you deliver. The officer of rules thought she was tightening her grip, but all she'd done was expose herself further. She believed she was the architect of order, but I saw her empire for what it was, a tower built on silence. And towers like that don't stand forever, not when cracks are already running through the foundation. The morning after the clipboard queen's parade, I couldn't shake the image of her hammering that notice to our fence, each nail like a gavel strike, each word a weapon. But what haunted me more was the smirk she wore when Rachel defied her, when Marcus froze, when Emily cried. That look said she believed she couldn't be touched. So I decided to touch what she valued most, her throne. Driving past the HOA clubhouse on my way to a job site, I slowed. Years of training made me read buildings the way most people read books. And this one? Its story screamed negligence. Electrical panels bolted outside, rust biting through their casings. I traced each panel with the trained eye of a man who's seen bridges buckle and walls surrender. Corrosion told stories, tiny betrayals written in metal. Her building whispered negligence so loudly I could almost hear the wires sigh. This was more than hypocrisy. It was structural arrogance. Outdated models, 20 years past code. Worse, the wiring spliced together like a patchwork quilt. Insulation frayed, grounds missing. Fire waiting to happen. I parked a block away, grabbed my clipboard, and walked back. To any passerby, I was just another contractor checking specs. But every step closer exposed more sins. HVAC patched with duct tape, roof lines sagging, drainage clogged. The officer of rules ran around policing children's clothing, while her own headquarters couldn't pass the most basic inspection. The hypocrisy was poison, and poison always spreads. I snapped photos quickly, steady hands despite the fury in my chest. Every junction box, every corroded line, every serial number that screamed illegal. My lens didn't lie, and neither would the county inspector. By dusk, the images were spread across my dining table. Emily hovered at the edge of the room, tugging her sleeves down, eyes locked on the evidence. "That's hers?" she whispered. "That's the empire she built," I answered, "and it's rotting from the inside." Rachel dropped by with untouched casserole, but her gaze caught the photos before the dish hit the counter. She gasped, pressing her hand to her mouth. "She's been holding meetings in there every week. Packed rooms, kids running through the halls. One spark, and it all burns," I said flatly. Rachel's expression shifted from fear to something sharper. Resolve. "So what happens when you show this?" I tapped the stack of photos. She built her power on theater, but this is the set collapsing. Outside, the tyrant in heels paced her lit-up living room, phone pressed tight to her ear, blinds wide open as if she wanted the whole block to watch her orchestrate another crusade. She believed her clipboard was untouchable. She had no idea her stage was made of tinder. Power, I realized, doesn't collapse in one blow. It rots quietly from the joints outward, and tonight I held the blueprint of that decay. By midnight, my satchel was packed, photos labeled, dates logged, violations matched to code. It wasn't just evidence, it was a demolition plan. Emily peeked in from the doorway, voice trembling but steady. "Will it stop her?" I knelt beside her. "This won't just stop her, Em. It'll prove she never had the right to start." The oak outside groaned in the night breeze, branches heavy with memory. Beneath its roots, my brother's ashes rested, a man who fought overseas to keep children safe. Now his daughter had been humiliated in her own neighborhood, and his brother was about to strike back. The enforcer in crimson thought fear was iron, but I had something stronger, facts sharp enough to cut through her entire kingdom. Tomorrow, I'd deliver them. And when I did, her clipboard wouldn't be a shield anymore. It would be a coffin. By dawn, the satchel with my evidence sat on the kitchen counter, its weight pressing into me like a loaded weapon. I hadn't slept, not because I was afraid, but because I refused to let the enforcer in crimson control another sunrise. Today, I planned to drive the file straight to the county inspector's office, but she struck first. At 7:12 sharp, the sound of hammering rattled through the cul-de-sac. Not the timid tap of a notice slipped into a mailbox. These were gavel blows, loud enough to wake every house on the block. Emily flinched so hard her spoon clattered against the table. Rachel froze mid-pour, coffee spilling across the counter. I ripped the door open. There she was, the tyrant in heels, crimson blazer sharp against the morning light, sunglasses perched like a crown. Clipboard under one arm, hammer in the other, flanked by 2 loyal volunteers, and nailed to my fence post in bold red ink, "Final removal order." Emily gasped. Rachel pressed both hands to her mouth. The officer of rules turned, her smirk curling wider as neighbors peeked through curtains. "Failure to comply will result in immediate seizure of property," she declared, voice slicing through the street. Her lieutenants scattered, stuffing duplicates of the notice into mailboxes. The sound of paper scraping metal carried through the street like static. Each envelope's hiss was another curse disguised as bureaucracy. I could almost feel the weight of those notices pressing on every doorstep, each one a little coffin of compliance, tucking them under windshield wipers, fear delivered like junk mail. I stepped off the porch, fists clenched around nothing. "You have no authority to do this." Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but the smirk stayed. "Authority," she said coolly, "is what the community recognizes, and right now, they recognize me." The clipboard queen wasn't just bluffing. She was performing, staging humiliation like theater, and the audience was every neighbor too scared to intervene. Rachel whispered behind me, "Daniel," her voice cracking. I planted myself between Emily and that crimson jacket. "This isn't enforcement, it's intimidation, and it ends now. If you'd stand your ground the same way, tap that like. It fuels more stories of ordinary people fighting back." The officer of rules tilted her head, lips twitching. "Or what? You'll wave your little evidence folder? By the time a judge sees it, your house will already be empty." Her words sliced deeper than I expected, not because they were true, but because she knew how to weaponize doubt. And doubt spreads faster than law. Emily's eyes brimmed, her sleeves pulled over her fists. "Uncle Dan," she whispered. Her trembling voice turned my resolve to steel. I tore the notice from the post, crumpling it in my fist until the paper cracked. This order means nothing, and soon everyone will see why. For the first time, the clipboard queen's smile faltered, just a twitch, but enough. She leaned closer, her voice a hiss. "Careful, Daniel. You're not just fighting me. You're fighting the system, property values, insurance, reputation. No one will stand with you when their wallets are on the line." I leaned in closer still. "You built your empire on fear, but fear isn't law, and your stage is about to burn." Her mask cracked for half a second before she turned sharply, heels striking pavement like war drums. She strutted down the block, her entourage scribbling notes no one would ever read. The moment she disappeared, Rachel collapsed onto the porch steps, the crumpled slip trembling in her hands. "How long can we live like this?" I crouched beside her, my voice steady. "Not much longer. She thinks this was her strongest move, but all she's done is expose herself further." Emily pressed against me, silent tears soaking my sleeve. The vow I'd made to her father burned in my chest. This wasn't just a fight. It was war. That night, I couldn't sit still. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that red slip nailed to the fence, the tyrant in heels smirking while Emily trembled. I spread my photos across the table again. Wiring violations, corroded panels, illegal patches, and began drafting a timeline sharper than any blade. She thought she'd stage the play, but what she didn't realize was that I wasn't just delivering evidence anymore. I was preparing spectacle, because the clipboard queen understood performance better than anyone, and if she wanted theater, then theater is where I'd destroy her. By morning, the cul-de-sac buzzed like a hornet's nest. The clipboard queen's removal notice had done its job. Neighbors huddled at mailboxes, clutching red slips like eviction orders, their voices hushed but sharp. Fear was her favorite ink, and she'd spilled it across every door in Willow Glen. But fear doesn't last forever. It fractures. And Marcus Reed was about to break. I found him under the oak tree near the park, his shoulders slumped as though the roots themselves were dragging him down. He wasn't in his collared shirt tonight. No clipboard, no stiff smile, just a wrinkled jacket. His hands jammed deep in his pockets like he was holding something that burned. His eyes flicked from house to house, the way a man looks when he knows every window is watching. "You shouldn't have ripped that notice down," he muttered when I approached, his voice brittle. "She shouldn't have nailed it up," I said. He looked away, jaw tight. Silence stretched, heavy, until he exhaled like a dam giving way. "I signed half of them. Alvarez, Chen, the Mitchells, all those notices. Every time she pushed one across the table, I signed." His hand trembled as he dragged it across his face. "God help me, I signed them all." His voice cracked open like a confession pulled from the soul's marrow. I'd seen hardened men admit less before prison gates. But Marcus wasn't chasing freedom. He was begging for forgiveness from walls that had ears. The confession hit harder than I expected, not because I didn't suspect it, but because of the way his voice cracked around the words. He wasn't just admitting complicity. He was drowning in it. I didn't soften. "Then you know exactly how far she's gone, and you know how it ends if you keep hiding behind her." He flinched, eyes darting toward his house. Through a thin curtain, I saw a silhouette, his wife standing at the sink, two smaller heads bobbing past her in the kitchen light. His children. His voice cracked again. "She told me once, fear works better than law. That's what the board chair said. Fear keeps them quiet." And I laughed. I laughed with her. His words burned like acid, not because they shocked me, but because he carried them like a scar carved into his chest. "You don't have to keep laughing," I said. "Not anymore." He shook his head, his whole body taut. "If I speak against her, she'll bury me, my wife, my kids. She'll bleed us dry with fines. She'll turn the block against us." "She can't," I shot back, firmer than I intended. "Her authority's expired. Every fine, every violation. It's smoke. And if you speak, if you put it in writing, you don't just clear your conscience, you end her reign." His hands shook as he reached into his pocket. What emerged wasn't a notice or a folded agenda. It was a slip of paper, creased and worn, the ink smudged from weeks of sweat. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. Across the top, scrawled in her jagged handwriting, "Teach them fear." My chest went cold. "She gave you this?" She shoved it across the table after Alvarez's boy got fined for a t-shirt. Said we had to make examples. I was supposed to file it. Instead, I kept it. His voice cracked again. Maybe part of me knew this day would come. That slip wasn't just evidence. It was intent. Proof the officer of rules had built her empire on cruelty by design. "Give it to me," I said. "Let me put it where she can't bury it." For a long moment, he didn't move. His fingers clutched the note like it was burning him alive. Then, with a shaky breath, he pressed it into my hand. "Do what I can't." I folded it carefully, sliding it into my satchel alongside the photos, the timelines, the records. The wrecking ball was nearly complete. Behind us, the oak tree groaned in the wind, its branches heavy with the weight of memory and promise. Tonight, it bore witness not just to fear, but to the first fracture from within her circle. Marcus stayed rooted to the spot, head bowed, his shoulders sagging like he'd been carrying a mountain too long. His silence had once been her sharpest weapon, but now that silence was gone. And the clipboard queen had no idea her own lieutenant had just handed me the blade that would cut her empire down. The paper burned in my pocket like a live wire. "Teach them fear." 4 words, jagged and venomous. Enough to unravel the clipboard queen's entire empire if I played them right. But evidence is only as strong as the ground you lay it on, and the enforcer in crimson had made sure the ground beneath us was quicksand. Neighbors still believed her fines carried weight. They paid out of fear, not law. If I moved too soon, she'd crush me, paint me as a bitter malcontent, and rally the timid around her. No, the timing had to be surgical. That night, I spread Marcus's note across my desk, alongside a growing map of violations, testimonies, and photographs. Every pin, every string, every arrow led back to her. The map looked less like an investigation and more like an autopsy. Red strings pulsed across it like arteries, each connection a wound she didn't know she'd inflicted. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was diagramming gravity, how every act of cruelty eventually caves in on itself. The tyrant in heels wasn't just abusing power. She'd been manufacturing terror, systematically breaking families down to keep her grip ironclad. The first move wasn't mine. It had to come from the board chair herself. People trust what they see, not what they're told. And I needed her to show her fangs in public, where no one could deny it. That's when I remembered the homeowners' forum scheduled for Thursday night. She thought it would be routine, a chance to scold, to dictate, to hammer down the trembling crowd. But I saw it for what it really was, a stage, and every tyrant eventually overplays their hand when the lights are brightest. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of my laptop screen washing over me. I wasn't just an architect of buildings anymore. I was about to architect her downfall. The plan was simple in form, lethal in execution. Step 1, gather allies. Not the loud, angry kind. They were easy targets for her. No, I wanted the quiet ones. The ones who'd suffered in silence, the single mother who paid $200 for a toy left on her porch, the retired veteran fined for a flag that wasn't regulation size, the Chen family whose son got cited for chalk drawings on the sidewalk. I'd speak to each of them, not to inflame, but to plant a seed. You're not alone, and she's not invincible. Step 2, create undeniable record. Marcus's note was the nail, but the coffin needed more. I began setting up discreet video calls, explaining HOA bylaw expiration dates, the lack of renewal filings, the technicality that nullified her authority years ago. Each time I saw the flicker of realization in their eyes, I felt the ground shift. Fear was eroding. Truth was taking root. Step 3, let her arrogance finish the job. The officer of rules would march into that Thursday meeting, believing she was still untouchable. But this time, every word she barked, every fine she threatened, every flash of cruelty, it would all be captured. Multiple phones, multiple angles, no more whispers in the dark. This time, the world would see her as she was. I knew the risks. If she caught wind of the plan before the meeting, she'd retaliate fast. Lawsuits, threats, even harassment. That's why discretion mattered. I met with neighbors in garages with the doors cracked just enough for air, in backyards under the hum of porch lights, on walking trails where the only witnesses were squirrels. Every conversation was hushed, urgent, a puzzle piece fitting into place. And in every meeting, I saw the same thing. Relief. Relief that someone was standing up, that maybe the nightmare could finally end. By Wednesday night, the web was woven tight. The enforcer in crimson thought she was still in control, but the strings had shifted. She was walking straight into her own trap. I looked again at the note Marcus had given me. Teach them fear. No, I thought, folding it carefully, sliding it back into its envelope. On Thursday, she'd teach them something else entirely. She'd teach them what it looked like when fear died in broad daylight. And she'd never see it coming. Dawn tasted different that day. Metallic, electric, like the air before thunder. Even the birds seemed cautious, their chirps tentative, as if they sensed something enormous shifting under the manicured lawns. The hours before battle always feel the longest. Thursday morning broke with an uneasy stillness, sunlight spilling across driveways like nothing was wrong. But I knew better. By sundown, the clipboard queen would walk into her own snare, and every neighbor who had trembled under her gavel would finally see her stripped of her illusion. I walked the neighborhood in deliberate silence, my phone buzzing with last-minute confirmations. The single mother whispered that her recording app was ready. The Chen family had volunteered their eldest son to angle his camera discreetly near the board's podium. A retired veteran assured me his phone battery was fully charged, muttering something about duty never leaving your blood. Each was a thread, and together they formed a net the enforcer in crimson wouldn't escape. But I couldn't rely on recordings alone. The tyrant in heels thrived on twisting narratives. She'd claim bias, cry out of context, turn victims into liars. No, what I needed was something absolute. That's why I called in a quiet favor. My brother Daniel, a federal agent who'd seen firsthand what unchecked power can do. He couldn't intervene, not yet, but he could watch. And sometimes the knowledge that authority is watching is enough to bend the course of history. By noon, I stood in my garage, blueprint rolls scattered across the workbench. Not blueprints of homes this time, but of her downfall. Strings. Connected faces, fines, and bylaws long past expiration. Each one a fracture line, and when pressure met those cracks tonight, her empire would split. The officer of rules still believed she held every card. She'd spent years perfecting that crimson-clad image of control, of certainty. She thought fear was permanent, that silence was compliance. But silence had been broken. One neighbor at a time, the whisper had grown into something she couldn't hear yet. But she would. Around 3 o'clock, I met Marcus at the walking trail again. His face carried the weight of someone who knew the storm was close. He didn't speak at first, just nodded, a signal that he'd do his part. I saw the conflict in his eyes, the loyalty torn between duty and conscience. But when he finally said, "She doesn't know what's coming," I knew the witness I'd been counting on had chosen his side, our side. The last piece of the puzzle was risk. I couldn't ignore it. If she sensed what I was orchestrating, she'd retaliate, hard. Lawsuits, retaliatory fines, character assassination. She wouldn't hesitate. That's why timing mattered. That's why everything hinged on her arrogance tonight. The sun began to dip, shadows stretching across fences and hedges. I slipped into the community hall an hour early. The room smelled faintly of bleach and dust. Rows of plastic chairs lined up in sterile order. The podium sat waiting, polished and expectant, like a stage for a one-woman performance. But tonight, the script wouldn't follow her cues. I checked sightlines, where neighbors would sit, where cameras could hide, where her eyes wouldn't land until it was too late. The air felt charged, like the hum before a lightning strike. Every detail mattered, every angle mattered, and then the doors began to open. One by one, the quiet ones walked in. Not loud, not confrontational, just present. That was enough. Their presence alone was rebellion. I stood at the back, heart steady, watching the clipboard queen enter at last. Crimson suit sharp as ever. heels clicking like a gavel striking marble. Her eyes swept the room, smug, expectant. She had no idea that every step was sealing her fate, because tonight wasn't her stage, it was her trial. The room hummed with low voices, neighbors settling into plastic chairs, the weight of years pressing on their shoulders. At the front, the board chair adjusted her papers, tapping a pen like a judge ready to pass sentence. She didn't notice the subtle tilt of phones aimed her way. She didn't sense the invisible eyes cataloging her every gesture. When the enforcer in crimson cleared her throat, the sound cut through the hall like a blade. "Order," she announced, as if control was something she could conjure at will. Neighbors shifted, stiffened, some looking down at their laps, others locking their gaze on her with simmering resentment. She relished it, the fear, the silence, the way power seemed to pool at her feet. But tonight, silence wouldn't serve her. The clipboard queen launched into her ritual list of infractions. Garden hedges too high, a faded mailbox flag, a child's bicycle left visible from the street. Her voice dripped disdain, cataloging lives as if they were stains on a ledger. Each strike of her tongue built a rhythm of oppression the community knew by heart. Yet something was different this time. Heads weren't just bowed in submission. They were raised, watching, calculating. The tyrant in heels glanced my way once, the corners of her lips curling in a faint smirk. She thought I was just another neighbor to humiliate, another man too timid to challenge her word. She didn't see the blueprint of her downfall in the steady way I stood at the back, hands folded, eyes unblinking. The officer of rules called for the next violation hearing. My niece's so-called indecent attire. Gasps rustled through the crowd. Mothers exchanged looks, fathers clenched fists. Children turned wide-eyed to their parents. She'd crossed a line so deep, even her allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That's when Marcus rose. Not fully, just enough to draw her eye. The conflicted board member's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his chair. His jaw flexed. His silence screamed louder than her accusations. For a moment, the enforcer in crimson faltered, her voice skipping like a scratched record. And in that pause, the trap snapped shut. Every lens in the room focused on her. Every whisper turned into silent testimony. The hall became a courtroom, the neighbors a jury, the clipboard queen the defendant. She didn't know it yet, but each word she spoke from here on was another nail in her own coffin. I felt the electricity build, the moment before a storm breaks. I could see neighbors who'd once hidden their anger leaning forward, their faces alive with something sharper than fear. Resolve. The enforcer still strutted, still spat her rehearsed poison, but her power no longer landed. It slipped, bounced back, cracked against the wall of cameras and witnesses waiting to expose her. And as she banged the table, demanding order, I realized she'd given it to us. Perfect evidence, framed by her own arrogance. Tonight, she wasn't leading a meeting. She was writing her confession. The board chair slammed her gavel against the table, desperate to restore the silence that once obeyed her every command. But silence was gone. It had been replaced with a murmur, swelling like a wave, neighbors leaning into each other, whispering, shaking their heads. For the first time, she wasn't feared. She was questioned. The enforcer in crimson barked into the crowd. "Order! You will not—" Her words splintered against the wall of voices that refused to dim. Phones hovered higher, screens glowing, recording every twitch of her face. A woman in the second row rose to her feet, trembling but firm. "You humiliated a child," she said, her voice steadying as others joined in nods. The clipboard queen sneered, her jaw tight. "She broke the standards?" But the room cut her off with a ripple of disbelieving laughter. The air shifted. Authority no longer belonged to the tyrant in heels. It belonged to the people staring her down. Marcus finally stood, not half risen, not hesitant. He stood tall. His face carried the weight of someone torn between loyalty and conscience, but his eyes no longer wavered. "Enough," he said, his voice low yet sharp. The neighbors quieted, the tension pulling tight as a wire. The officer of rules turned on him, betrayal flashing in her eyes. But Marcus didn't flinch. He looked directly at her, then at the crowd, and with that single act, he chose his side. I stepped forward, my voice cutting clean through the room. She isn't defending the community, she's dismantling it. I held up my phone, the footage already playing. The officer of rules berating my niece, her cruelty preserved in pixel clarity. Gasps broke through the hall. Mothers shielded their daughters, fathers rose with clenched jaws, and every eye seared the enforcer in crimson with disgust. Her face blanched, then hardened into rage. She pointed at me, shouting about protocol, about decorum, about respecting authority. But each word was drowned beneath the rolling tide of neighbors. One after another, voices rose, not in whispers now, but in declarations. A father called out about the fines he'd been forced to pay. An elderly woman spoke of harassment over her garden. A young couple mentioned the threats over their child's toys. The hall erupted into a reckoning. The clipboard queen clutched her papers as if they were armor, but the pages slipped from her grip, fluttering across the floor like the last fragments of her control. The tyrant in heels staggered, heels clicking against the tile, as if retreat could still save her. But she had nowhere left to run. Marcus turned to the crowd, his voice stronger now. "This isn't governance, it's abuse." The room roared in agreement. The enforcer's gavel struck again and again, but it only made her look weaker, desperate, unhinged. Each bang echoed as proof she'd lost the authority she clung to. I could feel the storm fully break now. The community had found its courage, and while the enforcer in crimson shouted for compliance, the people no longer bowed. They stood, they filmed, they testified. And in that sea of defiance, I saw it clearly. The board chair wasn't in control anymore. She was on trial. For a moment, time held its breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps, shadows trembling against the walls as if the building itself sensed justice approaching. The clipboard queen's eyes darted across the room, searching for loyalty. Finding only fear, papers lay scattered at her feet like the debris of a fallen kingdom. Even her own voice betrayed her, cracking on the edges of control. And in that fragile silence before consequence, the whole community leaned forward, waiting to see if the tyrant who ruled by fear would finally taste it herself. The gavel slipped from the board chair's hand, clattering against the table in a hollow echo that silenced even the angriest voices. She froze, crimson blazer gleaming under the harsh lights, her mask of authority cracking for everyone to see. For years, the enforcer in crimson had ruled with smirks and threats, but in that instant, she looked small, cornered prey in her own theater. Then the door burst open. The sheriff's deputies stepped inside first, shoulders squared, scanning the room. Behind them came agents in dark windbreakers, letters stitched bold across their chests. FBI. A ripple of shock swept through the hall. Phones tilted higher, gasps broke into shouts. The clipboard queen's face drained of color. One agent strode forward, voice firm and commanding. "This meeting is over. Federal investigation. Every board member will come with us." Chairs scraped. The tyrant in heels staggered back, words tumbling out in broken fragments. "This is absurd. You can't..." But her protest was swallowed by the snap of cuffs closing around her wrists. The officer of rules who once threatened families over fence paint now shuffled forward, her clipboard left behind, useless on the table. Her allies followed, faces pale, stripped of arrogance. The community that once cowered now leaned closer, not in fear, but in vindication. For the first time in years, the room belonged to the people, not to the tyrant who fed on their silence. I turned to Emily. She sat wide-eyed between Rachel and Marcus, her hands trembling, but this time not from fear. Relief cracked across her face, as if a weight had finally been lifted. My chest tightened with something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Neighbors began to speak, not to accuse, not to whisper, but to reclaim. Mr. Chin told the agents how he'd been fined for chalk drawings. Mrs. Alvarez described her son's humiliation. Marcus, the man who once hid behind silence, handed over his affidavit with steady hands. A murmur rippled near the back doors, the sound of tires outside, boots on concrete. For a split second, even she faltered. The clipboard lowered an inch. Power smells fear before anyone else does. The FBI agents listened, recording every word. The community was finally heard. Outside, The night air felt lighter, almost celebratory. Porch lights glowed like lanterns. I stood at the curb, watching laughter fill spaces that used to hold suspicion. It wasn't just relief. It was resurrection. For the first time in years, the neighborhood sounded human again. And for the first time in years, people lingered on sidewalks without fear of citations. Kids rode scooters across driveways, laughter scattering into the dark. The enforcer's SUV sat abandoned, its shine dulled, a monument to her downfall. I walked Emily to the oak tree, the same one rooted over my father's ashes, the same tree that had witnessed every humiliation. Tonight, it felt different. Not a sentinel of fear, but a symbol of survival. Emily rested her hand against its bark, whispering, "It's really over, isn't it?" I crouched beside her. It's over for her. For us, it's a beginning. A community rebuilt, without fear. Her smile, small but unshakable, was the truest victory I could have imagined. At Marcus's lawn, neighbors gathered around a handwritten sign, "Community Rebuild Meeting, 6 p.m. tomorrow." Pens passed from hand to hand, names filling the sheet faster than I thought possible. The voices that once whispered in shadows now carried into the night, firm and fearless. The clipboard queen thought she could brand a child indecent. Instead, she branded herself as the fraud who mistook fear for law. And her empire crumbled the only way it ever could, loudly, publicly, permanently. Want more real stories of people taking down HOA bullies? Hit subscribe, drop your story in the comments, and let me know where you're tuning in from. I looked across the block, at Rachel pouring lemonade into paper cups, at Marcus standing taller than ever, at Emily finally breathing free. The tyrant in heels had been dethroned, and in her place, something stronger rose. Unity,